mushrooms for people who don't want to do it small scale, or maybe you want to upscale and turn it into like a little small business for yourself. Who knows? So this is the fruit right here. This is the fruiting body. And before it becomes a fruiting body, we have something called the mycelium, which is basically this intertwining network. And then what the mushrooms produce is the spores. And from our perspective, we don't really need to worry about that. Basically, when the mushrooms are all done, and I almost brought in a sample of some, but I didn't want to risk cross-contamination. And this is the life cycle right here. But basically, the time it spends in fruiting is, about 2 weeks. The time it spends as mycelium can be 2 months to 2 years. And then as spores, this could just be a matter of days, essentially. And so when you decide, oh, I want to grow mushrooms for myself, what you're going to do is you're going to type in buying mushroom spawn on the interwebs. And on the interwebs, you're going to have all these different choices of companies that all want to sell you different types of mycelium. And then they will arrive to you just like this. They will be a solid white brick, most likely with a logo. And it's going to always have these little filter things in them because mushrooms need it to be absolutely sterile, but they also need to breathe. They actually are more like us when it comes to breathing. They breathe in oxygen and they breathe out carbon dioxide. And so they need to have a little bit of that air exchange going on there. And then just a shout out to the company I used, Field and Forest. They're based right out of Wisconsin. And so when you order substrate, spawn, let's take a step back and do a little vocabulary. The spawn is basically the term you use for something that's been fully colonized by the mycelium here. And so when you go onto these companies, you're basically getting someone who's taking care of the spore to the mycelium stage of it for you. Because in order to go from spores to mycelium, you either need the incredible luck of being out in nature, where you have literally, 1 in a million chance for it happening, but luckily you have over 1 million instances, so it's bound to happen. But in a lab, there's so much competing fungus and bacteria. For instance, if you have a community garden and you're trying to also turn that into a mushroom operation, it's next to impossible because in a community garden, and really any gardening or farming whatsoever, you're trying to cultivate certain types of soil bacteria, trichoderma. And those trichoderma are the eternal enemy and combatant against the spores and the mycelium here. So what these labs are doing, like at Field and Forest, they have their own little in-house grow factory. And they're taking the spores and then they're using really high-end, aseptic, basically super sterile technique in order to grow this initial little chunk of mycelium. And then this is what's called grain spawn right here. You can also get it in sawdust. You can get it as little plugs. A lot of people, when they think about growing mushrooms, they picture a drill and a big log on the table. Maybe some of you were expecting that today. They were expecting to see me walk in with a bunch of logs, some drills, and some wax. That's much more labor intensive, and I would have charged way more than $5 for that sort of workshop. This one I like, and I think should be shared more with people because it's actually possible for the average person to do this themselves. Because I got this for about, I think, 15 bucks plus another $10 in shipping. And then obviously the more you buy, the better the bang for your buck is on things. And you get this pre-inoculated chunk of mycelium. So then what you're doing is you're taking some, basically whatever your carbon waste is, maybe it's, you've got some old sawdust, maybe you've got some wood pellets, maybe you've got some wood shavings. In the case of oyster mushroom, which is the strain we're going to be working with today, you can literally use old books and pairs of jeans, and you can literally grow mushrooms on top of them. I could literally have come in here with some freshly boiled pants, stuck these in one of these bags, mixed in a little bit of this stuff right here, and then in about a month or two I could have gotten little mushrooms off it. Now obviously jeans isn't exactly the most optimum thing to grow mushrooms on, so you wouldn't exactly get big results, but it's more of a, what they would call a proof of concept, to demonstrate, hey, you can literally get mushrooms to grow on jeans and old books, because what do jeans, books, and wood chips all have in common? Carbon. They all have carbon, and then there's this very specific carbon to nitrogen ratio that mushrooms are looking to grow. Now plants, they want, you know, a ratio of soil, nitrogen to carbon in the soil of, let's say, 40:1. Well, with mushrooms, they want that reversed. They want that 40:1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And so, what we have here is, what you're all basically gonna be striving for today, is you're gonna have some sawdust, and then what you're gonna do is, you're gonna have an empty one of these bags, and you're gonna mix this sawdust with a few handfuls of what we get from these labs, because these labs are ensuring that you're getting a product that's fresh, which is really, really important, and most importantly is 100% what they say it is. If I were to just kind of do this in a spare room in a house or something like that, I wouldn't exactly trust myself very much for that. You have to have a dedicated facility to do that, which is why we use companies like these. And so what I did is, thanks to a lumber company, Chrissy, is there a name of the lumber company that I got this sawdust from? Because they gave me a whole bunch of the sawdust for free. I'd love to give them a shout out. They probably don't really care, but
I don't know that he has a name.
Okay, I think
Similar Forest, maybe?
okay, Similar Forest.
Any of the places that make saunas will give that away, so like the sauna guys and World of Wood.
Oh, really? World
Yeah,
of Wood?
it's all free.
Oh, excellent. So there you go. Now, quick note on that sawdust, you want to figure out and ask them what trees they're coming from. When it comes to cultivating mushrooms, you want mostly hardwood trees. Now, there are different strains of mushrooms, there are different types of substrate or growing mediums that you can use, but in the case of oysters, shiitake, and most mushrooms, they want hardwood. So make sure that they are processing ideally birch, maple, or oak. Those are going to be your main ones. So I'm going to say that again because that's going to be important. Birch, maple, and oak. Those are going to be your go-to for growing mushroom logs. Whether it be for shiitake or oyster, that's going to be the most readily accessible thing we have in this particular area. Pine is too acidic. It does not work. Other types of wood sometimes are just too soft. Woods like ashwood and ironwood could theoretically work, but they're usually not as thick and not as readily accessible as I found that birch and oak is. So that's usually, I tell people, use those, usually birch and oak. Oak, I would say, if I had to, you know, twist my arm, pick a favorite, I would say oak is the best one. So if you have the luxury of choice, try to find yourself some oak shavings or some oak logs to do mushroom experiments on. And so I actually have varying degrees. So I did another one of these workshops with Kaleidoscope, Key One Alternative Education. So if you do everything right, and you should be leaving with a bag about this size today. And I think if we all leave with a bag this size, for those who pay the $5 because it's quite material intensive, I assure you labor is not being charged in that $5 price. You should have this in 2 to 3 weeks. Hopefully. If it takes up to a month, that's okay. Maybe you just stuck it somewhere a little bit chilly. This has been in my basement, sitting at I'd say a constant 60 degrees now for those last 2 weeks. I think I bagged this on September 28th. So, heck, that may even only be maybe a week and a half that it's been there. But this is an example of a successful colonization. So you can see the sawdust, but you can also see these little flecks. Those little flecks is what the starting material was. And so what you're doing is you're basically trying to dial in the ratio. How many handfuls of this for how many handfuls of sawdust? And for this workshop with the kids, I was doing about 1 handful of this stuff to maybe 3 to 5 handfuls of the sawdust. Now, this number will vary depending on basically how lucky you are and how optimal conditions you can give it to grow. And I guess it kind of goes back with the luck, but it also depends on how good of sterile technique you have. If you have it so, you know, we mix the sawdust with this, you've perfectly pasteurized your sawdust, you've gone and like taken a shower, changed your clothes, doused yourself in a layer of bleach, alcohol, and peroxide all at once somehow, and then you had a perfectly vacuum sealed room that had UV lights sterilizing everything with a crazy, you know, vacuum that would suck the air and then sterilize you walking, like total hazmat conditions, then maybe you could do 1 handful of this inside of an entire bucket. because that's how it works in nature. You're starting off with just a few spores that find their way onto some old log or some rich carbon substrate of some sort, because there is agaricus mushrooms which will grow, you know, right out of the soil, but that's a whole nother workshop right there. It's counting on that, being able to just find that little insertion point and then being able to spread all through from just that one point. So it's possible, literally one handful to this whole thing, but in a setting like this, with this many people, or in the case of when I did it a few weeks ago with a bunch of kids, who I say, all right, everyone, go wash your hands and don't touch anything, you know, and come back in here, and we'll begin. They come back with their hands up, and then they proceed to pull out their chair, sit down on it, lean on top of the table, and then I say, you guys hands clean? Like, oh yeah, we haven't touched a thing, we swear. And so in that case, you have to do a higher ratio of this, because that's basically the game you're playing. It's a competition game. You're basically rooting on your horse in the derby. The oyster mycelium is going to outpace and outcompete the trichoderma or the black mold or any other type of fungus that you might be having. And so a lot of times when you do this, you can actually go and look up what the mold count is outside on the day that you do your whole mushroom process. And so a lot of times in the middle of a hot, humid day in summer, it's not a good idea because there's going to be all sorts of spores and mold flying around. And I'm not sure if you guys realize this, but COVID was not to get us more aware of biological pathogens. COVID was there to teach us how to become excellent growers of mushrooms. Because the same technique that you used to, you know, make sure you were clean and everyone else around you was clean, safe, and sterile, you're going to want to take that exact same paranoid mentality and apply it to the mushrooms. And even like I said, before anyone touches anything, you're going to go out and you're going to be washing your hands. You're going to be pulling your sleeves up, because what happens is, as you're pouring stuff in the bag here, your arms are going to scrape along the inside of the bag. And it may be something as simple as, show of hands, did anyone go to a community garden or their backyard garden at any point this morning? All right, so you're what's known as the high-risk group. And so I would love it if you guys went last, if you are getting a kit today, because you are probably covered in trichoderma, you are probably covered in other types of soil bacteria, which, like I said, are the complete and utter mortal enemy of our fungus. Because I'm not sure if you guys realize, but in 1 tablespoon of soil, there's over 1,000 different, not 1,000 total, 1,000 different types of microbials, fungus, bacteria, and they're not holding hands in a circle singing kumbaya. They're at mortal war with each other inside of that little tablespoon of soil. Each one trying to outcompete the other one and sometimes eat the other one to get whatever carbon, nitrogen, and micronutrients they may have inside. And so with that mentality of what's going on when you're putting this spawn in the bag, we'll better prepare you. And that's why I'm spending so much time on this portion of it, because sterility will make or break if you have a good time doing mushrooms. And if you have success today, that's fantastic. I recommend, you know, scaling up, trying some other things. You may be wondering, what's the best way to pasteurize some of this sawdust right here? On a small scale, you're going to want to use an Instant Pot or a pressure cooker. That is the best way. What you do is you go on over to Risto's Hardware, a proud sponsor of this presentation, as well as Copper Country Recycling Initiative, who is hosting this event today. Big thanks to Copper Country Recycling Initiative, your go-to source for Hope in Cleveland County recycling information. So now, back to, there we go. There are over hardware hanks right here across the way on Hancock. I asked the owner, Risto, if he could start supplying the nylon bags that I use to pasteurize mushroom substrate in, and he did it. That's what's awesome about small hardware stores like that. I go into Walmart and say, hey, can you guys do this? And then the person looks back at me blankly and goes, what? So you pay a little extra at those small stores, but you get that sort of instant communication and organization that happens. So you're going to get these nylon stockings, and you basically can fill it up with sawdust, and it's the nylon ones, basically they use it for paint straining. So basically you'd go into a hardware store and say, hey, do you have 5-gallon paint strainers or 1-gallon paint strainers available? That works perfect, as good as any other thing that you're going to find. But if you want to scale up, because this mycelium is expensive, so a lot of times the only way to justify it is to kind of bulk buy and coordinate with other people. you're gonna wanna get a propane burner or basically some wood fire. And then you get ideally like a 55-gallon drum or some other container that can be heated, and basically you boil the water inside of it, and you basically steam your sawdust. Now you need to make sure though, and this is why I bring up the nylon thing, if you use sawdust, it's very fine. And so in order to get the steam and the boiling action, you have to make sure that your sawdust isn't basically wicking it up and soaking up all your water. Otherwise, you're just gonna burn your sawdust, and that's actually what you're gonna find today, and here's a little sample of the sawdust. Your sawdust is gonna be a little bit burned, because I kinda screwed up in making the little support that holds up all the sawdust. And when I got the sawdust wet, I forgot to take into account that it gets a lot heavier. And so what happens is it caused the little, I used some really tight mesh wiring, and I laid it over itself, and I stuck it in the bottom of the barrel, and then I used a cinder block to basically prop it up and create some space between the water and where the sawdust was sitting up above it. Problem is, I didn't put enough of a, basically support slats across the cinder block, and so it caved in from the outside, sawdust spilled into there, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what you're gonna wanna take into account, because you have to make sure that it's not too wet. And then we're gonna do an example of this right before we begin. So you notice I tilt this over, there's no water dribbling out, maybe just a little bit right there. That's all you want right there. If there's too much water, then it chokes out the oxygen that's in the sawdust, and it needs that perfect balance. And you're gonna notice with this stuff right here, that I got it a little bit too wet, and it's even kind of dribbling out right there. I'm gonna have to clean that up later. And so as you take your sawdust out of here, you're gonna wanna give it a real good squeeze, and then put it into your bag. Too much water will screw up your mushrooms. All right, so we've covered the life cycle, we've covered being really safe and sterile. Are there any questions up until this point? Yes.
Can you use a Mayu Maya?
A Mayu Maya?
You don't know what a Maya, it's a finished juicer. You have a reservoir of water underneath, and then you have like, a container that you can pull the juice out, but you can block it off. And then, there's a strainer in there that you would put the berries in. Could you put sawdust in there instead
You
and
could.
steam them?
As long as you don't mind getting potential some sawdust inside of your food handling stuff, because the same equipment you use for your food works great for sterilizing all this stuff, but it does make a little bit of a mess. So yes, if it has the power of straining, then it's fine. But ideally what you're gonna wanna do, and you'll see a lot of information online about this, is you want to soak, I think the rule of thumb is something like 1.5 parts of water weight to however much weight of sawdust. So if you have 10 pounds of sawdust, you're going to mix about 15 pounds of water with it in order to make just about the right moisture content. For me personally, I just get a big tub, I pour the sawdust in, and then I get some nice filtered water, and then I just kind of mix it in there, almost like you're mixing dough. And then you basically, just like mixing dough, you pour water in so that it absorbs just the right amount of water and not one droplet more. Once you have a nice wet mixture that when you pick it up and you squeeze it, no water comes out, and then you've reached that perfect ratio of water to the substrate that you're working with. Now obviously if you're doing big old logs, all the moisture is already sealed in the log, and that's why you wax over the log to trap it in there. But when we're using with stuff like this and sawdust shavings, it's a little bit different.
How long do you pressure cook it for?
About a half hour. It depends as well. Like, let's say you decide you want to use grain. With grain, you have to do it a lot longer because grain is a much denser, and so it takes longer to get into the core. Because a lot of grain, a lot of times, has dormant pathogens and bacteria on the inside of the endospore of the grain. Unlike sawdust, of course, which has no such thing. So that's one of the reasons also why I really like sawdust, is because it does pasteurize really fast. Basically, as soon as I achieve pressurization, where there's enough steam inside that it makes the lid want to explode off, or the Instant Pot of the pressure cooker starting to whistle, that's how you know you've reached enough. And then ideally you just let it sit in that pressurized state for about a half hour. And then if you're curious, you can always let it cool down, get a little IR gun, or just do the ow that hurts test, just kind of stick your hand on it, and if it just burns your hand like crazy, congratulations, you've probably reached pasteurization temperature, and it's ready to cool down. And then there's, I guess, sort of maybe not so much a debate, but some people wonder, is it better to, once you're done pasteurizing it, to pop it out and just kind of cool it off and then immediately use? or leave it sealed until the next day when it's had a chance to naturally go down to room temperature. Because some people, it's a bit of a pain pasteurizing it the night before and then doing it the next day. But based off experience now, that really is the preferred way to do it, because this is used to operating around 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you're pasteurizing at 140 to 160. So obviously it's gonna take some time to cool off, and because of all the moisture content in it, it takes a surprisingly long time for hot sawdust to cool down. So I usually tell people, leave it sealed, everything in there is already pasteurized and clean. Now just let it sit until the next day, and then that way you just leave it sitting here, and then you can go and sterilize yourself, and you're gonna see that. We're gonna spray down the bags with alcohol, we're gonna spray down the table with alcohol, we're gonna spray our arms off with alcohol, and then once we have everything there, then you pop it up, it's already perfect room temperature, and then you do your thing. Alright, so I got some kids who have been waving their arms, yes.
How long does it take to have the mushroom pop up?
Ah, so, once we put it in the bags, so this is a wide range right here, but for oyster mushrooms, it's gonna be probably, you know what? It could be anywhere from 2 to 5 months. Because what we're doing is we are going to be doing a fairly high ratio of the spawn here to the sawdust, because I want to, again, account for there being so many variables of particular pathogens, and who knows what you guys all brought in with you, who knows how clean the library is. And also because I want this type of workshop that's all about creating that yes experience. We are much more likely to carry on with a hobby if our initial interaction with that hobby is a success. And then so I call it the yes experience, because I teach kids. And with kids, you know instantly they go, because they go, yes, it worked. Because they go out, they see their bag is fully colonized, and they're like, all right, positive time, dopamine rush, serotonin, oh, I feel good now. Those are neurotransmitters in our brain that make us feel happy, for those who aren't with that one. My degree is in pharmaceutical chemistry, so sometimes I get a little bit caught up in the action. So, to answer your question, it's gonna be about 2 to 5 months sitting inside that bag, but you know it's gonna be ready once and you guys can kind of see the gradient. This one, I triggered early. Now you'd be wondering, well, what's the harm of triggering early? Well, your mushrooms just aren't gonna be as big. This is probably the only cluster I'm gonna get out of this bag, and it's probably only gonna get a few times bigger. I kind of prematurely did it so you can kind of see what it looks like. What you really wanna wait for is for it to look like this. You want it to get to the point where you almost can't see through it. Now this differs between, if you're growing shiitake mushroom, shiitake mycelium is almost invisible. You literally have to just set a timer for yourself. All right, 5 months from now I'm gonna go pop my shiitake bag. But with oyster, it's super easy. It's like the ultimate beginner growing mushroom, because it straight up tells you, okay, this thing is bursting out of the bag, it's colonized every last square inch, and it's a really thick white. And then you'll start to notice that it starts to recede from the bag, because it's literally eating all that nutrients in there. And it's just like growing a plant out of a planter box. Eventually you start to notice, hey, my planter box soil keeps getting lower, and it's not just because it's compacting, it's because it's literally being extracted out by, in this case, the mushroom. So that usually happens in about, so this is 2 weeks, and this is really fast. We added a lot of the starting material into this one, so this one will probably be ready in about 2 months, I'd say, and I'm going to probably poke a hole in it. If I were to have a full bag like this one right here, and just looking at how much is colonized already, because this one's been sitting for about a month now, and so it's actually got even less, and that's why I don't want to give you guys any hard answers, because your conditions may vary. And you may also just get a bad luck of the draw. One of these buckets may have just some random bit of bacteria or something. I bleached and peroxided everything before I put it in there, but you never know. Everything is a bit of a flip of the coin. That's just how it is in the microscopic world of things. So once you trigger it, and then the way you trigger it is you just poke a hole in it. You literally can just take a fork and stab it. You can take a knife, stab it. You can split like a little X on there, which some people will do. Literally, you just need to poke a hole, because once you poke that hole, it's exposing the mushroom to atmosphere, because inside these bags, carbon dioxide is building up. And then when you poke the hole, all of a sudden it's like a breath of fresh air going in there. And then some people will then soak their bag for 24 hours or for 12 hours in order to kind of stimulate it. Probably won't need to do it with these bags because there's a good chance your substrate's gonna be a little bit wet, because I had that aforementioned issue with the pasteurization today. And so, if it's already looks like you've got a lot of water like running around in there, you can see this one is bone dry. If this is our example of a colonized bag, I poke a hole and probably give this one a soak overnight for sure. Looking at this one right here, you know, I don't see a whole lot of water running. I did not pre-soak this one before popping it, and you can see it's popping out there just fine, all on its own. And then I will also add this note right now as well. You'll notice that there's little, almost like the mushrooms are trying to grow inside of the bag, even though it's completely sealed and I didn't poke any holes there. So when that starts to happen, just ignore it. That's pretty much the mushroom trying to reach out and see if there's any openings. It basically, that's its way of saying, like, I've colonized enough of this that I could fruit now for you if you want, and if the conditions are right, and it's basically feeling out. And so what I did is I said, you know what, I have this workshop coming up, let's go ahead and let you fruit. So I poked a hole near one of them, and then because of this network of almost root-like looking stuff, the mycelium, it has the ability to transfer all the nutrients and water inside of it through those. So as soon as you poke a hole in one side, it'll start to basically vampire, suck out, transfer over the nutrients and those other little feelers it's got going on, and it's gonna channel it all to where it just got that new hole found. So you don't need to worry about chasing after and trying to poke holes in every single one. I recommend just poking out one hole, because now the mushroom's gonna put all its energy, or rather the mycelium's gonna put all its energy into just that one spot to give you a more satisfying cluster, because I do this as much for the aesthetics as I do for the actual mushrooms to eat. And what would happen if you were to, and I'm sure that's the follow-up question a lot of you have, what were to happen if I did poke all those holes? What would happen? Well, what you would do is you would get more mushrooms, but they would be less dense and less large in size. And so it comes down to preference. If you want it to look like, almost like a mushroom log in nature, then you poke those holes everywhere, and you're gonna get a bunch like little mushrooms popping out everywhere. Maybe that's what you wanna go for. But most professional growers and most people, after doing it and trying it, they really do prefer just doing the one hole. That way, if they have a bunch of shelving, because remember, if you're thinking about commercialization, they're gonna have like those really like cheap stainless steel racks. I think every single person probably has one in their garage or basement somewhere. You can get them on Amazon or at Walmart, and they are absolutely fantastic and cost effective, because you can line up maybe 8 of these bags on just one top shelf right there. And then when it's fully white, you just go through and you just stab, 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 and then you have these perfect clusters come out on just one side. That's another reason why a lot of people opt for one side. You poke it all the way on 360. Well, now you need to make sure you have access to your bag all 360. Now, if you're just doing this for fun and you only got one bag, that's no problem. But if you want to think about, okay, let's do this professionally, then something like that you're going to want to take into account. So that's why I just like the one poke. And then once that poke is made, it's about 2 weeks. And so a quick metaphor, if you will, comparing an apple to a mushroom. So the mushroom is the fruit of the whole fungus thing, just like the apple is the fruit of the apple tree. The apple fruit season is usually just a couple weeks out of the year that it's actually